The gavel slammed at the livestock auction, finalizing a $45,000 bid for a prize seed bull. Cousin Beatrice shoved the invoice into my hands. "Your family contribution," she announced to the surrounding ranchers. Marion and Silas watched with smug satisfaction, expecting me to drain my veterinary clinic's savings to subsidize their empire. I felt no panic, only absolute clarity. I pulled out my checkbook and finalized the transaction. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Driving back from the auction, the Texas heat baked the asphalt, but my mind was entirely clinical. For 34 years, my existence in this family had been categorized as an unpaid liability. I was an orphan niece taken in by Marion and Silas, a transaction they never let me forget. They provided room and board. In exchange, I became the silent laborer of their cattle dynasty. While Beatrice and Warren received full university tuitions and European vacations, I spent my youth knee-deep in mud, tending to sick calves and managing the herd. They called it building character. I now recognized it as a highly profitable labor acquisition. This is the insidious nature of normalized exploitation. When you are raised inside a deficit, you are conditioned to believe you owe a debt just for breathing. Abuse is rarely announced with a megaphone. It is quietly integrated into the daily routine until the victim believes that working for free is simply the rent required to exist. I was the silent investor in their version of family, and my dividends were paid entirely in exhaustion. I had built my large animal veterinary practice from nothing, relying on grit and compounding interest, while they paraded around as regional aristocrats. But the true depth of their accounting fraud went far beyond unpaid labor. When my parents died, they left behind a substantial parcel of grazing land. Silas had sold it when I was still a minor. The proceeds, exactly $450,000, were supposed to be held in trust for my future. Instead, that money was quietly absorbed into Marion and Silas's operating budget. They used my inheritance to expand their pastures and secure their social standing, leaving me to fund my own veterinary degree through student loans and midnight shifts. For years, I had accepted this arrangement, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. These are the invisible chains of the survivor. You map out the terrain of your abuser's moods, learning to navigate the minefields of their entitlement. You convince yourself that keeping the peace is a noble pursuit, when in reality, it is simply a hostage negotiation. When dissent equals isolation, compliance becomes your primary survival mechanism. I had learned early on that challenging Silas meant being cut off from the only shelter I knew. I had swallowed the financial discrepancies and the blatant favoritism because questioning the ledger would have meant facing the terrifying reality that my family viewed me not as blood, but as inventory. But writing that $45,000 check at the auction had finalized our contract. The survival instinct that had kept me compliant was abruptly replaced by a demand for an audit. I didn't feel betrayed. Betrayal implies an expectation of loyalty. I simply recognized that I had been funding a bad investment, and it was time to liquidate my shares. The emotional ties were officially severed, replaced by cold, hard arithmetic. I pulled into the driveway of my modest clinic, turned off the engine, and opened my laptop. It was time to balance the books. I expected some form of fallout from the auction, but their response only confirmed the total bankruptcy of their character. If they felt a shred of remorse for draining my clinic's accounts, they hid it flawlessly. Instead of guilt, they doubled down, treating my silent compliance as an open invitation for further extraction. They were operating under the assumption that my silence was a renewable resource. Less than 24 hours after the auction, the digital attacks began. I logged into the regional agricultural forums, the primary networking hub for local ranchers and livestock owners, to find a meticulously coordinated smear campaign. Beatrice was the architect. Using a thinly veiled anonymous account, she seeded doubts about my veterinary credentials. She posted fabricated stories of misdiagnosed herds and overbilled consultations. She claimed my clinic was facing bankruptcy due to incompetence, weaponizing the very financial deficit she had just created to destroy my professional reputation. She wasn't trying to teach me a lesson. She was actively trying to eliminate me from the regional economy. She wanted to ensure I remained dependent on their cattle empire for survival. As I read the forum posts, my phone illuminated with an incoming text from Aunt Marion. I didn't feel a spike of anxiety. I viewed it with the detachment of an auditor discovering another fraudulent receipt. The message read that Warren was booking his summer trip to Italy, the auction had set them back slightly, and they needed me to transfer $5,000 to his account by Friday. She added that it was the least I could do after all the support they had provided. I stared at the glowing screen. They had just forced me to pay $45,000 for their prize bull, effectively wiping out the emergency reserves I needed to keep my clinic operational. Now, they were demanding another $5,000 to fund my adult cousin's European vacation. There was no delusion left, no lingering hope that beneath their harsh exterior lay a bedrock of familial affection. My aunt and uncle were not misguided relatives, they were financial parasites. Warren, complacent and entirely comfortable living off stolen labor, was just another liability. Beatrice was a calculated saboteur. I assessed their actions not as personal slights, but as gross violations of our implicit contract. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon a trace of sadness or regret for the family I was about to dismantle. There was nothing. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and they were massively overdrawn. I took screenshots of Beatrice's forum posts. I exported the text message from Marion. I gathered every piece of communication, every financial demand, and every digital attack, organizing them into a secure digital vault. I didn't reply to Marion. I didn't defend myself on the forums. Reacting would only prove that their leverage still worked. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had kept filed away for months. The time for silent endurance was over. The time for legal retaliation had begun. The next morning, I walked into the downtown offices of Julia, the most ruthless agricultural attorney in the Texas Hill Country. I didn't bring tissues or a sob story. I brought a flash drive containing 3 decades of bank statements, property records, and the recent correspondence from Marion and Beatrice. I sat across from Julia's mahogany desk and laid out the parameters of our engagement. I didn't want mediation. I wanted a forensic audit. Julia moved with the same clinical precision I felt. Within 48 hours, she had deployed a team of forensic accountants to tear through the financial history of the ranch. What they uncovered shifted the paradigm from civil exploitation to felony-level criminality. I sat in Julia's office a week later, reviewing the compiled dossier. The evidence was irrefutable. The $450,000 from my parents' land sale hadn't just been absorbed into the ranch's general fund. Silas had actively forged deed transfers and trust documents, legally dissolving my ownership rights before I was old enough to understand a contract. They had systematically laundered stolen trust money through shell companies to purchase adjoining parcels of land, expanding their empire entirely on my stolen inheritance. But the most lethal discovery lay in the paperwork for the prize seed bull I had been forced to purchase at the auction. Julia handed me the genetic registry and breeding lineage for the animal. I traced the alphanumeric codes down the page, my eyes locking on to a specific origin tag. The $45,000 bull didn't belong to a rival breeder. It traced directly back to a rare, highly specialized cattle strain that my biological father had engineered before his death. Silas hadn't just forced me to buy a random piece of livestock. He had sadistically maneuvered me into purchasing the last remaining genetic link to my own father's legacy, using the very money I had earned through grueling labor to buy back what should have been mine by birthright. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to erase my father's memory and assert total dominance over my future. They wanted me to pay for the privilege of my own erasure. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. The revelation removed any lingering hesitation I might have harbored. They weren't just greedy, they were malicious. The financial trap was a mechanism of psychological warfare. Julia stated that they had committed multiple counts of wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Her tone was devoid of sympathy, strictly focused on the tactical advantage. She informed me we could take the evidence to the district attorney today and freeze their assets by tomorrow. I replied with a voice as steady and cold as steel. I told her that filing quiet injunctions would give them time to spin a narrative. They built their power on social capital and public perception. If we struck, we had to do it where they had no cover. I looked at the calendar on Julia's wall. The regional agricultural gala was 3 days away. Silas and Marion were expected to finalize a massive distribution partnership that evening, the crown jewel of their stolen empire. I instructed Julia that we were going to the gala. We were going to liquidate their reputation. The Regional Agricultural Gala was the premier networking event of the season, a glittering assembly of Stetson hats and designer gowns held in the grand ballroom of the Austin Convention Center. This was the arena where empires were cemented. Silas and Marion held court near the center of the room, radiating unearned confidence. They were aggressively lobbying the executives of a national meat distribution syndicate, desperate to secure a partnership that would solidify their financial dominance for the next decade. I stood near the entrance, flanked by Julia and a figure whose presence alone could alter the gravitational pull of the room. Eleanor, my 82-year-old great-grandmother and the founding matriarch of the cattle dynasty. She had officially retired years ago, residing in a quiet estate on the edge of the property, entirely detached from the daily operations. Silas had assumed she was too frail and isolated to notice his accounting discrepancies. He had gravely miscalculated. When I had shown Eleanor the forensic audit 2 days prior, she hadn't cried over her family's betrayal. She had simply asked Julia to draft the necessary termination documents. As Silas raised a glass to toast the prospective distributors, I gave Eleanor a curt nod. We moved across the ballroom floor. The crowd naturally parted for the matriarch, a silence rippling outward as we approached the center table. Silas lowered his glass, his smug smile faltering as he registered Julia's presence beside me. Marion's face drained of color. Silas stammered, attempting to project authority. He told his mother they didn't expect her tonight and that they were in the middle of closing the distribution contract. Eleanor announced that he wasn't closing anything. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the lethal weight of an absolute monarch. She told him he no longer had the authority to negotiate on behalf of the family. Before Silas could mount a defense, Julia stepped forward and signaled the audio-visual team we had preemptively retained. The massive presentation screens behind the main stage flickered to life. Instead of the gala's sponsor logos, the screens displayed high-resolution scans of the forged deed transfers, the diverted trust fund routing numbers, and the genetic registry of the seed bull. The ballroom plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. Eleanor declared that she had built the ranch on a foundation of integrity and relentless labor. Her gaze locked on Silas and Marion, sweeping over Beatrice and Warren, who cowered in the background. She announced to the room that they had operated the ranch as a criminal syndicate, stealing $450,000 from an orphaned child and forging documents to expand their own pastures. She exposed how they attempted to destroy my veterinary practice and charged me $45,000 to buy back my own father's legacy. The distribution executives immediately stepped away from Silas, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. Eleanor continued, her tone clinical and absolute. She declared that, effective immediately, Silas and Marion were stripped of all management rights and access to the ranch's capital. The authorities had already been provided with the audit. Silas opened his mouth, his face purple with rage, but there was no defense to mount. The numbers were glowing on the screens above them. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. In a matter of minutes, their social capital, their financial security, and their legacy were systematically liquidated in front of the entire agricultural community. The destruction was swift, methodical, and absolute. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the district attorney's office had formally indicted Silas and Marion on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Their personal bank accounts were frozen. The fleet of luxury vehicles they had paraded around town was seized. Forced to cover mounting legal fees and court-ordered restitution, their personal assets were systematically liquidated. They were evicted from the main estate, relegated to a cramped, rented apartment on the outskirts of the county. Beatrice, stripped of her unlimited credit cards and the protective shield of her family's wealth, found herself entirely ostracized. The agricultural community, fiercely protective of its own reputation, permanently blacklisted her. Her digital smear campaign against my clinic was exposed as fraudulent, and she was forced to issue a public retraction to avoid a devastating defamation lawsuit. Warren's European vacation was canceled, his accounts drained to pay for his parents' criminal defense retainers. Within 30 days, the legal transfer of the historic ranch estate was fully executed. As the rightful heir and the only competent operator left, I was granted total ownership and control of the dynasty. Walking through the massive halls of the main house, listening to the hollow echo of my boots against the hardwood floors, I observed the remnants of my aunt and uncle's tenure. This is the illusion of power in an empty wallet. For decades, Silas and Marion had operated under the delusion that their status was inherent, an unshakable right granted by their last name. They equated luxury with superiority and mistook financial bullying for genuine strength. But power derived entirely from stolen capital is just a rental agreement. Once the stolen funds were retracted, the facade crumbled, revealing that they possessed no actual skills, no genuine loyalty from their peers, and no internal moral compass to guide them through adversity. Their entire identity was a hollow shell propped up by the money they had siphoned from my existence. Take away the bank accounts, and they instantly collapsed into irrelevant, desperate figures, completely unequipped to navigate the reality of consequence. They had spent their lives believing that whoever controlled the ledger controlled the family. They simply never anticipated that the silent investor they had exploited for 34 years would eventually demand an audit. I didn't feel pity as I boxed up their remaining personal effects to be shipped to their apartment. I didn't feel triumph either. I felt the crisp, unburdened clarity of a perfectly balanced sheet. The debt they owed me had been collected with interest. The toxic liability of their presence had been completely expunged from my portfolio. I had reclaimed my father's genetic lineage, secured my clinic's future, and removed the parasites from the host. I locked the front door of the estate, slipping the heavy brass key into my pocket. The ranch was no longer a monument to their entitlement. It was simply the raw capital I would use to build something entirely my own. The vault was empty of their influence, leaving me with a clean slate and unlimited acreage. With the ranch firmly under my control and my veterinary clinic operating at peak capacity, I shifted my focus from demolition to construction. The $45,000 I had originally paid for the seed bowl was fully refunded by the estate. I didn't absorb it back into my personal accounts. Instead, I established the Eleanor Heritage Grant. The grant was designed with clinical precision, an annual, fully funded scholarship dedicated to underprivileged rural students pursuing degrees in large animal veterinary medicine. I wanted to ensure that no ambitious student in the Hill Country would ever be forced to trade their dignity or their labor for the chance to build a career. This is the justice of the sower. True retaliation isn't found in mirroring the destruction of your abusers. It is found in rendering their malice entirely irrelevant. When you destroy a toxic hierarchy, you are left with a plot of scorched earth. The ultimate execution of justice is choosing to plant something vital and enduring in the very soil they tried to poison. By converting the proceeds of their extortion into an educational foundation, I redefined the legacy of their crime. I didn't just defeat them in a boardroom. I structurally engineered a reality where their cruelty financed the empowerment of the next generation. They tried to erase my future, and in response, I guaranteed the futures of dozens of others. As I stood on the porch of the main house, watching the rare strain of my father's cattle grazing on the open horizon, the heavy weight that had defined my life finally dissipated. I've come to realize that keeping the peace in a toxic family is simply a polite term for self-destruction. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires endless accommodation, that enduring abuse is a noble sacrifice, and that walking away from our relatives is a moral failure. But true peace requires radical honesty. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the psychological debts they forced you to carry. I had to forgive myself for the years I spent complying with their demands, for believing that my value was intrinsically tied to my utility in their operations. I learned that a boundary is a complete sentence. It does not require a justification. a debate, an audit, or an apology. Cutting ties with Silas, Marion, Beatrice, and Warren was the most profoundly healing and empowering decision I have ever made. I did not lose a family. I excised a systemic infection. Now, looking out over the open land that is rightfully mine, surrounded by the legacy of my biological father and the formidable matriarch who stood by me, I finally feel genuinely rooted. I am no longer surviving on the margins of someone else's empire. I am the absolute architect of my own. When a family member calls your boundaries selfish, are they asking for love or asking you to make their life easier at your expense? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more stories on reclaiming your peace.